Well, welcome back to another episode with Michael Horner, and we've been talking about this 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 idea that runs around in our culture that religion has been the cause of more wars and more violence and et cetera, et cetera. But is it really true? And when we actually look at the track record of history and what scholars are actually telling us, it's a very different story. And Michael has been sort of walking us through that. So Michael, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to
Good.
discussing this concept too, because I think it's an important issue in our culture, and it relates to what I'm trying to do with this whole series: is try to expose cultural myths, cultural falsehoods that are influential and causing damage, and trying to set the record straight. And this idea that religions are somehow uniquely um, violent in a way that other worldviews aren't, I think is very close to the center uh, of beliefs in our culture. And if we look at the origin of it, though, we begin to see that there's some questions here. How and why did this idea develop? And is it based on good reasons? And I don't think it is.
Yeah. Well, I'm
So
looking
last
forward to
week we
hearing.
saw, or last time we saw Kavanaugh begin to make his case, and we finished with him saying the following. He said, "I argue that the legend of the wars of religion is not simply objective history, but is itself an ideological accompaniment to shifts in Western configurations of power, especially the transfer of lethal loyalty to the emergent state." Now that's an academic way of putting it. Uh, he's basically saying uh, it's not, this idea that religion is violent isn't just a result of studying history in an objective sense, but there was other factors going on. Um, that this was helpful. This idea was helpful to Enlightenment thinkers as the shift of power was moving uh, from the church to the state over the centuries. And so that's kind of where we're going to look at it today: is what is the purpose that this idea feeds? This idea that religion causes violence. How did that serve people at that time in the Enlightenment period of time? What purpose was it? And Kavanaugh says, I show how useful this myth has been in the United States. Now, his whole book is focused on the United States, and written as an American, and really to Americans for the most part. But it's still instructive to people who do not live in the United States. Uh, he says that this myth has been useful in the United States in authorizing certain types of power in both domestic politics and foreign policy. So those are the two categories: domestic politics and then foreign policy. And I'm going to focus mostly on domestic politics here. And every once in a while, I'll kind of touch on his other point, which he makes a much bigger deal of: foreign policy, especially with respect to how the Americans treat Muslims. So, first of all, in domestic politics, he says it's helped to marginalize certain practices such as public school prayer and aid to parochial schools. At the same time, it has helped to reinforce patriotic adherence to the nation state as that which saves us from our more divisive identities. So that's the domestic side of things. And in the foreign policy side of things, he says the myth of religious violence helps to reinforce and justify Western attitudes and policies toward the non Western world, especially Muslims, whose primary point of difference with the West is said to be their stubborn refusal to tame religious passions in the public sphere. And he says it's important to note that arguments about religion and violence are not necessarily anti-religion, but they are anti-public religion. That is anti the religion having a public influence and impact. Although the majority of Americans consider themselves to be religious, the overwhelming majority also regard the secularization of politics as foundational to any rational and civilized society. And so the question is, how did this belief become part of the core of the American thinking? And I think it stretches beyond the United States. Muslims, he says, are commonly stereotyped as fanatical and dangerous because they have not learned, as we have, he says, to separate politics from religion. Now, this is not to say that Cavanaugh or myself are against separation of church and state. Both of us are. But it is to say, in this foreign policy area, that Muslims should not be dismissed as fanatical and dangerous just because they're religious. It would have to be more specific than that. And I think there are some good reasons to dismiss jihadists as being fanatical and dangerous. Now, that may or may not be all Muslims. But the point is, the religious myth that we're talking about here is the idea that just because one is religious, they are inherently more violent, fanatical, and dangerous. And that is the myth that Cavanaugh and myself are trying to expose here. So Cavanaugh says, I examined the use of the myth of religious violence in the U.S. Supreme Court decisions since the 1940s. So now we're back to domestic issues here. Previously, he says, religion was generally seen as a unitive force, a glue that helped bind the nation together. In fact, when you read the founders of the American Republic, religion was seen that way. The emphasis was made on this republic's only going to work with a moral people, and religion was widely understood. Broad consensus that it's only religious people that can be sufficiently moral. But there was the beginnings of a more radical thinking among Enlightenment thinkers, and it takes that has taken a while to spread and become more radical. And so Cavanaugh says, beginning in the 1940s, however, the specter of religious violence was cited in case after case involving the religion clauses of the First Amendment, as the court moved to ban school prayer, state aid for parochial schools, public religious displays on government grounds, and other practices. They were using religious violence as the reason why this had to be done. So Cavanaugh says, I note that the myth of religious violence was found useful at the moment in U.S. history in which the threat of the kind of sectarian violence against which it warned had never been more remote. There was no religious violence to be worried about in the 1940s. But that was precisely the reasons given for these domestic cases about prayer and First Amendment and state aid for Catholic schools and that sort of thing. He says, I show as well how patriotism has been invoked by the court as the cure for religious divisiveness. Patriotic public invocations of God are specifically excluded from the category of religion, and therefore they're not subject to the kind of restrictions put on religion. So this gets to the issue, okay, what's considered religious and what isn't considered religious? And we're going to look at that in detail in just a moment. And he says, once again, what counts as religion and what does not is not dependent on the presence or absence of belief in God, but on a political decision about the inculcation of loyalty to the nation state. That's what he thinks is really going on here.
Interesting. So if it serves the purpose of increased loyalty to the state, then that's okay. But if it doesn't, that's not okay.
And it's okay because we're going to label it non-religious.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas anything we label religious is not okay. That's dangerous and potentially, fanatical and so on. So that's what Cavanaugh's arguing for. He said he wants to show that the argument that religion is prone to violence is a significant component in the construction of an opposition between the West and the rest of the world. So this is, the foreign policy side of things. If religion has a peculiar tendency to promote violence, then societies that have learned to tame religious passions in public are seen as superior and more inherently peaceable than societies which have not. Hey, I admit I've been influenced by this very thinking, by the way that I've thought about Muslims myself. And I think, well, you guys just need to have a separation of church and state here. Your Sharia law thing is just out to lunch. And I think there might be a kernel of truth there. But it's not, Sharia law shouldn't be looked down upon just because it's religious. It should be evaluated on the basis of whether it's harmful or not harmful, actually dangerous or not dangerous. And I would argue that just being religious is not sufficient to remove it from influence in public policy. That is a radical understanding of separation of church and state that was existent in the minds of some of the Enlightenment thinkers, and that has taken time and has grown and is now most commonly found among people that you and I have probably debated a number of times, who were members of secular humanist associations, secular humanist societies, and so on. They tend to be the type of people that I think are committed to this concept more than other atheists might be. So he says, I show how the myth of religious violence is commonly used to bypass actual historical events and to find the answer to the question, why do they hate us, in the pathological irrationality of religiously based social orders. So, Americans are often asking that question, why do they hate us? Even some of the rest of us in the West might be asking that question. Why do people in the rest of the world or other parts of the world hate the West? And the answer is usually given, well, just they're religious and they're prone to violence, and that's the answer. Whereas Cavanaugh says, no, there are very good reasons why non-Western countries should hate America, and this is what he talks about next. He says, the logic is impeccable. We are dealing with an inherently violent, this is the logic that he's going to challenge now, and he's being sarcastic. He says the logic is impeccable. If we are dealing with inherently violent and irrational social orders, there's not much hope of reasoning with them. We must be prepared to use military force. The hope is that through both gentle and forceful means, we may spread the blessings of liberal social order to the Islamic world. Thus is the myth of religious violence used to justify violence. A strong contrast is drawn between religious and secular violence. Violence that is labeled religious is always peculiarly virulent and reprehensible, but violence that is labeled secular hardly even counts as violence at all, since it is inherently peacemaking. Secular violence is often necessary and sometimes praiseworthy, especially when it's used to quell the inherent violence of religion. I mean, I'm reading this and going, yeah, that's what I've kind of thought, because that's what I've been indoctrinated with, along with everyone else in the West. Cavanaugh says, I do not wish either to deny the virtues of liberalism, and nor do I, by the way, nor to excuse the vices of other kinds of social orders. And again, neither do I. But I think that the separation of church and state is generally a good thing, Cavanaugh says, and I agree. On the other side, there is no question that certain forms of Muslim beliefs and practices do promote violence, and such forms should be examined and criticized. It is unhelpful, however, to undertake that criticism through the lens of a groundless religious secular dichotomy that causes us to turn a blind eye to secular forms of imperialism and violence. And I would add the following statement that both Christianity in the West and Islam outside the West have targets of this myth, have been targets of this myth of religious violence. But this is prior to the woke phenomena. And this is a bit of a rabbit trail that I don't want to go off into, but I think a lot of people noticed after 9/11. I mean, I was expecting people to be critical of Islam, and it was there for a couple of years. Then all of a sudden, it wasn't. All of a sudden, the criticism wasn't of Islam. In fact, that became Islamophobia, and all the guns were turned against domestic terrorism. by far right wing Americans and sort of thing, and all of a sudden, it wasn't, Islam wasn't even being blamed anymore. Well, that's because there's at least one other entity in the mix here, and that is sort of the woke type thinking, and that separates people into oppressors and oppressed, and that began to influence and overtake the more enlightenment type thinking. So we're not going to get off into that woke thinking right now, but I think that was just an interesting thing that happened in the last 15 to 20 years. So Cavanaugh says it would help us to see that the foundational possibilities for social orders in the Islamic world and the West are not limited to a stark choice between theocracy and secularism. He says it would help us to see past the stereotype of the non-secular others as religious fanatics, and it would question one of the justifications for war against these others. So I think he's identifying there's two extremes here. Theocracy on the one hand and secularism on the other. And that those aren't the only choices, though, he's saying. There is some proper middle ground in between those two, and those aren't our only two choices. So let's stop there for a moment before we move into the idea of how do people separate religious from non-religious things, and how scholars tried to do that.
Yeah, it's I never actually thought of it before in terms of what's religion that'll actually help bolster state is not defined as religious, and what is, else the rest of it gets banned from the public arena of life. Pretty big. There might actually be almost a counter parallel or between the religion of, let's say, earlier religion where the church and state were amalgamated, and what was considered to be political and aspects of the state that would help religion was actually embraced and incorporated into religion, which was not so good. But that's not what we're worried about here. What we're worried about here is this other phenomenon. And I guess the question that we're not going to answer probably on this podcast, but how much should we trust the state to save us and to save us from all our problems and to solve our difficulties? How much should we trust the secular state? Right. But it's just it's like you put your faith in one thing or the other. You're going to put your faith in, and I am a little uncomfortable with always using the term religion because, like anything, there's religion can be defiled. Like, say, for example, the teachings of Jesus are one thing. The broader form of Christianity as it's taken over the centuries has not always followed those teachings. And I would hate to label myself as one of those broad type Christians. I would not want to label myself as that. Or even religious if it includes things that are counter to the teachings of Jesus as well. So
Yeah.
these are all, but I think we've talked about that. We've been very clear on that there is a distinction between the teachings of Jesus and what, say, the church sometimes may have promoted or encouraged or at least let happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, how this happened is interesting because Cavanaugh says, someone might say, everybody knows what we mean when we say religion. And he says, when you hear somebody say that, one should react as one would when urged by a realtor to waive the inspection of the house.
Yeah,
You need to inspect the house.
absolutely. In fact, when I hear a lot of these people talking about religion, I wonder if they even, it's very simplistic. It's a simplistic notion of religion. It's kind of like this homogenous bad thing that's out there. In fact, I've often heard the term organized religion.
Yeah.
Put those two together. And what is that? And I think there is an enormous need to actually stop and think, what are we talking about? About religion, and how do we define that? And is it 100% bad? Are the teachings of Jesus included in religion? Is that bad, or is it actually good? And if it's good, then how maybe we should nuance this use of the word religion. But waiving the inspection of a house that you're interested in buying, that's kind of foolish a lot of times. Well, most of the time. But in this case, people just get away with it because almost nobody is worried about really defining that term very well. At least nobody on the street, nobody in the everyday
some
world.
scholars have tried
Scholars
to do that,
are,
but it's notoriously difficult, and that's what we're going to see here. And Kavanaugh's taking issue with the dominant view that has taken hold, which concludes that religion is just inherently violent, much more so than any other view. And so he says, the arguments I examine attempt to separate a category called religion, which is prone to violence because it's supposedly absolutist, divisive, and non-rational, from a secular or non-religious reality that is less prone to violence, presumably because it's less absolutist, more unitive, and more rational. As we shall see, such arguments do not stand up to scrutiny because they cannot find any coherent way to separate religious from secular violence. A careful examination, he says, of the varieties of each and the empirical conditions under which each does in fact support violence is helpful and necessary. What is not helpful is the attempt to divide the above list into religious and secular phenomena and then claim that the former are more prone to violence. As we shall see, such a division is arbitrary and unsustainable on either theoretical or empirical grounds. So that's where he's headed. He says the religious-secular dichotomy in the arguments examined sanctions the condemnation of certain kinds of violence and the overlooking of other kinds of violence. He says, I will argue that the myth of religious violence is so prevalent because while it delegitimates certain kinds of violence, it's used to legitimate other kinds of violence, namely violence done in the name of secular Western ideals. The argument that religion causes violence sanctions a dichotomy between, on the one hand, non-Western, especially Muslim, forms of culture, which, having not yet learned to privatize matters of faith, are absolutist, divisive, and irrational, and Western culture, on the other hand, which is modest in its claims to truth, unitive, and rational. This dichotomy, this clash of civilizations' worldview, in turn, can be used to legitimate the use of violence against those with whom it's impossible to reason on our own terms. In short, their violence is fanatical and uncontrolled. Our violence is controlled, reasonable, and often regrettably necessary to contain their violence. Although the figures I examine in this chapter may reject the use of their arguments to sanction violence, the only way to ensure against this use is to abandon arguments that posit the inherent dangers of religion and thereby posit the inherent superiority of secularist societies. I think that sums up pretty well both the nature of the myth and why Cavanaugh thinks it's a problem.
Yeah. That sounds pretty straight to me, pretty clear.
So he says then, I analyze a variety of arguments that religion causes violence and show how, in each case, the author himself cannot manage to maintain a coherent division between religious and secular violence. They mistake a contingent power arrangement of the modern West for a universal and timeless feature of human existence. No one, let me just skip that part. I'll move right down here. He does an analysis now of John Hick. John Hick was a well-known British philosopher. In fact, our good friend William Lane Craig did his PhD in philosophy under tutelage of John Hick at University of Birmingham in Britain. And Hick became sort of well-known for his relativistic views of religion in the 70s and following. And one of the things that Hick did in his writings was analyze, what is religion. And so Hick went through some changes. In his 1973 book, God and the Universe of Faiths, Hick proposes a, quote, a definition of religion as an understanding of the universe, together with an appropriate way of living within it, which involves reference beyond the natural world to God or gods, or to the absolute, or to a transcendent order or process. And if I'd heard him say that back then, I probably said, yeah, that sounds all right to me. It's not a bad definition of religion, maybe. And so according to Hick, this includes theistic faiths such as Christianity, Islam, theistic Hinduism, and also non-theistic faiths such as Theravada Buddhism and non-theistic Hinduism. And Hick confidently asserts that this definition excludes natural systems of belief such as communism and humanism. By his 1989 book, though, An Interpretation of Religion, Hick is no longer so sure that he can draw such sharp lines between what is religion and what is not. He seems newly aware of the growing debate among scholars over whether the term religion is useful or should be scrapped altogether. And Hick admits the extreme difficulty of deciding whether Confucianism, Theravada Buddhism, and Marxism should be called religious. None has a deity, yet all share certain characteristics with what are normally considered to be religions. And this is where the problems begin to show here. So Hick's dilemma is, according to Cavanaugh, is that if he defines religion too narrowly, he will exclude things he wants to include, like Confucianism. If he defines religion too broadly, it will include things he wants to exclude, like Marxism. His solution is to attempt to dissolve the problem of definition. If he does so consistently, however, the distinction between religious and secular dissolves as well. And all kinds of concerns can be considered ultimate concerns, which means religious concerns. Without a clear distinction between what is religious and what is not religious, any argument that religion per se does or does not cause violence becomes hopelessly arbitrary. Now, this is where Cavanaugh is making his point. Why focus our attention, for example, on the violence of Muslim and Christian fundamentalisms and not on the monumental horrors wrought by Marxism and nationalism in the 20th century, if all belong in the extended family of ultimate concerns? So once you kind of get rid of trying to define religion, it's just hard to separate them. One can ignore the latter only by shuffling them off to a peripheral category of secular ideologies whose tendencies to absolutism are thereby minimized. And the point is not that Christian and Muslim violence do not exist, Cavanaugh says, nor that they should be ignored or excused. The point is that the religious secular dichotomy operating within the religion causes violence argument focuses our attention towards some kinds of violence, those labeled religious, and away from others, those labeled secular.
Very good point.
So he concludes this section by saying, we must conclude that the myth of the wars of religion is finally incredible. And he's using that word and tells us so by saying, which is to say false. When he says they're incredible, they're unbelievable, they're not to be believed. Why? Because they're false. The myth of the wars of religion is false. Now, next episode, we're going to take a little rabbit trail and look specifically at the 30 Years' War, which is the main item that people looked at during the Enlightenment times and still is looked at by secular humanists and some academics as the proof that religion causes wars and must be bridled at the very least, if not completely separated from any influence on public policy. So Cavanaugh says a significant proportion of the violence in terms of religious wars was between members of the same church and members of different churches often collaborated. And this is something we're going to see next episode in the 30 Years' Wars. And it's impossible to separate religious motives from political, economic, and social causes. And the idea that the advent of the state solved the violence, which is part of the myth of religious violence, is that the advent of the liberal state solved this violence, ignores abundant evidence that the state building was perhaps the most significant cause of the violence itself. So that's quite a significant claim that he is making there.
Yeah, I think here's my own perception of what's going on right now with the state in general, and I'm just throwing this out there, not as if, here's the last word on it, but I think because a lot of people have not really familiarized themselves with what a rigid religion is like. Let's say just use a more more of a legalistic form of Christianity where you're not allowed to say certain words, you must do this and you must never do that. And there's this strict set of rules that are not actually found in the Bible, but they're added. I think people don't realize that the secular state right now is rapidly going down that same road with the words that you are not allowed to use, statements and causes you're not allowed to be seen supporting or even in the same photograph with if it happens on a street protest or whatever. An increasing number of laws and passed to prevent people from saying things that the state feels they might disagree with. Maybe it's worse in Canada than in the US. I'm thinking about the government-funded media or substantial amounts of cash that go to the media, and there's almost this implicit understanding not to bite the hand that feeds you, but the government itself, which is not really the government. I think a government is formed of individual human beings, and this is where you get human nature stepping in or beginning to influence the whole pot of stew, so to speak. Human nature often wants power and sees any threats to that power as a problem, and that occurs whether human nature infiltrates the church or human infiltrates the secular government. The methods are almost the same. It can be very brutal when you look at some forms of communist states in the 20th century. Legislation increasingly wanting to monitor what everybody says and does. It's just so reminiscent of almost an extremist form of religion that's highly legalistic with a lot of rules and laws. And the bottom line is, a police officer of mine, after retired, or as he was retiring, said that after 30 years he had to enforce 3 times as many laws as he did when he joined 30 years early, to try and make people behave. And that's the key thing. How do you make people behave, and how do you make them behave in the eyes of the state? The state might have a different idea of what behaving is. But anyways, I think this line between religion and the state gets pretty blurry when you see where the state is going today, at least in some cases here in the West.
Yeah, I think that's probably another whole episode or few episodes on the shift in the last 10 to 15 years. Is something different that's going on. And for lack of a better label, the influence of wokeism is, it's not just a continuation of the secularism that has been going on. There's something else that has, and this is a slight turn here, as some people call it, the new absolutism. And I think there's something to that.
Yeah.
So back to Cavanaugh then. He says, I want to question the triumphalist view of the liberal state. The shift from church power to state power is not the victory of peaceable reason over irrational religious violence. The more we tell ourselves it is, the more we are capable of ignoring the violence that we do in the name of reason and freedom. And he's referring to the violence done domestically, to believers domestically, and also to religious believers in terms of foreign policy. And he says, my hypothesis is that the myth of the wars of religion, like the larger myth of religious violence, has been useful for the promotion of Western secular forms of governance as essentially peacemaking. According to the myth, only by carefully separating the dangerous impulses of religion from the mundane affairs of politics, as the liberal state has done, can a peaceful and prosperous world be finally achieved. In domestic politics, the myth serves both to legitimate devotion to the nation state and to marginalize actors labeled religious from the public square. And in foreign affairs, the myth serves to justify efforts to promote and propagate Western forms of governance in the non-Western world by violence if necessary. That's a pretty clear statement of his hypothesis. I want to add my own thoughts to this at this point here. I think we are in religious wars right now. The difference is one side doesn't accept the label of religious for themselves. They don't consider themselves to be religious. They reserve that label as a smear to be used against the other side, and as Cavanaugh argues, to deny it access to the public square by coercion, force, and even violence if necessary, slowly moving more in that direction. Radical secularism, and the adjective radical is important here, because I do believe in the separation of church and state, but radical secularism, the view that religion should not have any influence on public policy, contains a view about God and religion. I mean, that is a view about God and religion itself, the view that religion shouldn't have any public influence in public policy. That's a religious view, because it's a view about God and religion. Secularists either deny that God exists, or they most often claim they lack a belief in God, since there are no good reasons to believe that God exists, they claim. So those are views or positions about God. Why should those views about God be given power and freedom to influence the public square, whereas other views about God are marginalized, discriminated against, and in some cases compelled by the force of government power to keep their ideas for human flourishing out of the public square? I got to add a little anecdote here from my history. I had the interesting privilege of debating Henry Morgentaler. I think it was 1990. And Henry Morgentaler is best known as being the person that basically got abortion decriminalized in Canada by his willingness to go to jail over something that he sincerely believed in, that he thought that the rights of women were being denied. Although most people don't realize that he had a limit, because he thought that once the brainstem developed in the 5th month, that abortion was immoral. But, and that didn't come out for many, many years. I knew that just from personal conversations with him. And when it finally came out, his followers rejected him before he passed. Anyway, we debated, but it wasn't about the debate of abortion. We debated because he was the founder of the Secular Humanist Society of Canada. And so we debated on that question. Secular humanism or Christian humanism, which is the best idea for human flourishing. And I in preparing for the debate, I determined that I was going to react strongly at one point. I was determined to be civil and respectful, but I was going to act strongly if Morgentaler made the claim that secularism is neutral. It's non-discriminatory. It's just a neutral thing. You shouldn't be worried about it. And at a certain point in the debate, he made that claim that secularism is neutral. And I came with my planned attack. I said, well, that's garbage. And proceeded to explain why it's garbage. It was a very poor move by my part as a debater. That was just a poor choice of words. I could tell as soon as I said it. Not only was there a gap in the audience of mostly secular people, but even my mentor, William Lane Craig, sitting in the front row watching me, I saw his reaction and I thought, whoops, wrong word. I hadn't lost my temper. I hadn't got angry, but it was perceived that way.
Yeah.
And that's the one debate that I lost according to a vote in the West. I lost one in Hong Kong too, but there are other reasons for that. But I think my point was correct. I should have used a different word. I think if I was to do it again, I would have said something like, I think that statement that secularism is neutral is complete nonsense, and here's why. I think that would have gone across much better. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that's the point that is being made here. This idea that secularism is neutral, and it's not actually a religious view itself, is nonsense.
Yeah, it's a philosophical, like people, sometimes we have to discuss what's the difference between a philosophical view and a religious view. And the line there too can be a little hard to define, but what people don't realize when they want to promote a secular state is what they're actually doing is promoting a philosophy, a removal of anything to do with God from the way the state is governed.
Yeah, if it's really the radical view,
they're promoting atheism. Yeah. But they wouldn't say it's atheism because it's to their advantage to portray sometimes the atheist as almost these radicals out there. They're not that. They just simply want to operate as if there is no God. And there was a philosopher by the name of Hebert. How about old paper? He said to fail to, let's say he was talking about teaching students in the classroom. To fail to teach students about the classroom, about God in the classroom, or at least give them some philosophical things to think about, is to implicitly suggest it's irrelevant. And when you do that, you're actually helping to promote the other view, which is, in this case, maybe we'd call it secular humanism at best. But secular humanism is getting pretty close to religion as well. You're just shifting who you're going to put your faith in.
Right. So in continuing with some of my own thoughts here, I said, why are secular views about God given the power and freedom to influence public square, whereas other views about God are marginalized? And the answer is that, well, secularism holds the view that positions on religion other than their own are prone to violence, while their views are prone to peacekeeping. So we're right back to this, the core point here. This myth of religious violence is a foundational belief that much of what our culture does is built upon, even though we don't realize it. And it's just the assumption that secular views are prone to peacekeeping and religious views are prone to violence. So this essential myth is a pillar of secularism, especially radical secularism, that justifies their marginalizing religious views from the public square. Take that pillar away, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to justify the assumptions that modern secularism is based upon. It is such an essential pillar that for most of us, it is, to change metaphors, a part of the very air that we breathe. We've been sufficiently indoctrinated with this myth that religious violence is more common and worse than irreligious violence that it just seems true. But it's not. The evidence doesn't support this. We saw this a few episodes back when we asked the question, what about irreligion? How does it fare? And it was even worse than religious violence. Well, what about the separation of church and state then? Well, there's a strong case that can and has been made that the separation of church and state actually comes from Jesus himself when he was asked about paying taxes to Rome. And he says, well, you give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and unto God that which is God's. The Baptist letter argued for the separation of church and state from the perspective of keeping the state out of the affairs of the church. So this is Christians arguing for the separation of church and state. And the main focus was keeping the state away from controlling the church. But the radical view of a wall of separation between church and state that keeps religious views completely out of public policy is built upon this myth of religious violence and wars. Moreover, it merely, and I wanted to use the word disenfranchises here, but that's not quite the correct word because that means you take away someone's vote. And I don't mean exactly that, but I mean, it removes the influence of one view of religion in order to enfranchise, again, not quite the right word, but embed another view as the sole influence in public policy. Now that is discriminatory. And when this seems right to you, it's only because you've been thoroughly indoctrinated with the false cultural myth that religion is uniquely violent in ways that irreligion is not. The historical evidence does not support that assumption. But the assumption itself was formulated as a pillar of the Enlightenment narrative for the purpose of removing Christian influence and replacing it with the influence of a different kind of religion, an atheistic view that sees religion as false and harmful and violent. So that's my soapbox that on this thing here. And just want to move to some final points by Cavanaugh here. Cavanaugh says the myth of religious violence should finally be seen for what it is. It's an important part of the folklore of Western societies. It does not identify any facts about the world, but rather authorizes certain arrangements of power in the modern West. It's a story of salvation from mortal peril by the creation of the secular nation state. And as such, it legitimates the direction of the citizens' ultimate loyalty to the nation state and secures the nation state's monopoly on legitimate violence. In the United States, it helps to foster the idea that secular social orders are inherently peaceful, such that we become convinced that the nation that spends more on its military than do all other nations of the world combined is in fact the world's most peace-loving country. He's a little more harsh towards the United States here than I think even I would be, that he's an American. The myth also helps to identify others and enemies, both internal and external, who threaten the social order and who provide the requisite villains against which the nation state is said to protect us. He adds, the myth of religious violence is false, and it has had a significant negative influence. The myth should be retired from respectable discourse. To do so would offer some important benefits. First, it would free the valuable empirical work on violence that is being done by scholars. There's important work that's being done on violence. What are the real sources of it? And he says we need to get rid of this a priori view that religion is just the cause, when there's many other factors involved. Rather than attempt to come up with reasons that a universal and timeless feature of human society called religion has a peculiar tendency to promote violence, the question for researchers would be, under what circumstances do ideologies and practices of all kinds promote violence? Empirical investigations into violent uses of nationalism, the sacrificial atonement of Christ, the invisible hand of the market, jihad, Marxist utopias, and the view of the United States as a worldwide liberator would not be hampered by an a priori division of such ideologies and practices into religious and secular. Because all those views need to be evaluated, he says, for what are the real reasons. Investigation into the link between religion and violence would then become investigation into the ways in which the twin terms, religious and secular, have been used to authorize different practices of power in the modern world. Included would be investigating how the construction of certain practices as religious has authorized certain kinds of violence labeled secular. My input here at the end of this section is that it is wrong to a priori judge actions as wrong just because they are religious or just because they are secular or non-religious. Rather, under what circumstances can both religious and secular ideas cause violence should be the operative question. This still allows one to draw the conclusion that some Islamic violence is wrong, not because it's religious, but because some of the teachings of Islam teach and prescribe the violence. It also allows one to conclude that some actions of Christians are wrong, not because they're religious, but because they cause violence. And simultaneously, the teachings of Jesus, that is, teachings of Christianity, that Jesus and the apostles and the scriptures are not the cause of the violence done by the Christians. This is an important and necessary distinction to make that avoids the two false extremes of all religious actions are wrong or no religious actions are wrong. Cavanaugh says second advance or benefit here by getting rid of this, the abandoning the myth of religious violence, is that it would help us see that Western-style secularism is a contingent and local set of social arrangements and not the universal solution to the universal problem of religion. The range of options available to any given society, including our own, is not exhausted, as we mentioned before, by the choice between theocracy on the one hand and militant secularism on the other hand. One, he says, is doing away with the myth of religious violence would help to eliminate one of the justifications for military action against religious actors. I see this as happening both domestically and in foreign policy in the West. If the unreasonableness of an opponent were not determined a priori, the resort to violence might be forestalled long enough to permit a more peaceable outcome. But if you just immediately assume that, well, they're religious, therefore they're violent, then that you just jump immediately to a violent response, right? We must restore the full and complete picture of violence in our world to level the playing field so that violence of all kinds is subject to the same scrutiny. This does not mean that all violence is therefore morally equivalent. To level the playing field is not to declare that the contest will result in a tie before it's ever begun. It's rather to agree to call fouls committed by any and all participants and to penalize them equally. So, Cavanaugh said much more than this. It was its entire book. I really encourage people to get a copy of the book, The Myth of Religious Violence by William T. Cavanaugh, Oxford University Press. And it's worth reading. And as I said, next week we're going to look at a specific example that is usually used to prove this case. And it was used right at the beginning when this kind of became this foundational myth, and it's still being used, and that's the 30 Years' War, where it's viewed as just these religions just killing each other. And it's proof that, religion must be bridled, marginalized, if not completely brought under control of the non-religious secular state. And we'll find that the consensus is that those wars are actually not considered religious anymore by many scholars.
Well, yeah, once again, Michael, I had, this has been a real education for me. This, I have not believed, I've not just swallowed this urban myth that runs around here, and I am aware of some statistics to justify my lack of credulity when faced with these myths, but the information that you have goes way beyond this. It really is. It is very helpful. At one point during your discussion here today, I was reminded of a quote from Charles Malik, a Lebanese diplomat, the United Nations.
One of my heroes.
Yeah.
I got to meet him in 1982 in Toronto. It's awesome.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a privilege. But he said the separation of church and state was meant to be a separation of institutions.
Yes.
It was never meant to be a separation of ideas. Exactly. And yet today it's not even the ideas are permitted, but if God is the origin of every good thing given, and those ideas are true and what actually causes human flourishing, to reject those ideas out of any influence in the judicial system or the government, we're in deep trouble, or we would accelerate a collapse of civilization, because if we do that, and it's happening here, at least.
Yeah, that might be the introduction to the section on wokeism. This is what happens when it's taken too far.
Yeah, that'll be well worth discussing, wokeism. I would say if I have a fear right now, the greatest fear of forces at play in our society, which has the tendency to the greatest trampling of human freedoms and the most violence, and actually promoting the greatest amount of hatred, it would be wokeism, or at least where it's going. It started off with noble intentions, but where it's going now and what it's done, it's almost like something worse than the Inquisition. It'd be interesting to
it's weaponized wonderful concepts like love, compassion, and empathy, and it's turned them into weapons now. It's amazing. And what's interesting is some of our secular humanist friends, we're now on the same team. Dealing with this. Many of them recognize the problems, and it's created some strange bedfellows. I just listened to a couple of podcasts this week on Frank Turek, Dr. Frank Turek, as a thinker and a Christian apologist, does a great job at his podcast. I think it goes under two different titles. Cross-Examined, I think, is one title, or I don't have enough faith to be an atheist is another phrase he uses. But he interviewed Dr. James Lindsay, who is a self-identified atheist, but he's a very good thinker on what's the origin of wokeism and his philosophical understanding. And he's on the evangelical Christian speaking tour right now.
He's an atheist, but he's a thinking atheist. It is interesting that the common ground that we have is that we're thinking carefully and deeply about things. So, and actually that's a whole category of atheism that I've often mentioned to people. They tend to see it as a homogenous group, but no, there's different categories, and one of them is that branch of that category or set of atheists who think deeply on things and very carefully on things. And sometimes we find ourselves on common ground.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks, Michael. It's been another fascinating discussion, and we'll look forward to the next episode.
All right. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, bye for now.
Bye.